Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's special summer series, curated by the Rail section editors. During the weeks of July 19 and July 26th, we are celebrating the sections that make up the Brooklyn Rail, which you can find in print on our website, free and accessible to all. Our conversations this week will celebrate the editorial diversity covered in the Rail and here in our virtual events. I'm Paul Mattick, the editor of the Field Notes section at the Rail. I've been doing this since 2014, and I'm particularly happy to host Phil Neel. Those of you who've been reading Field Notes for a while will have read some of his classic essays, and I also I'm very happy to mention that he wrote the first Field Notes book, Hinterland, which is a truly fantastic book. If you haven't read it, you should read it. It's out in paperback as of last year. And it's an absolutely fascinating and also very beautifully written piece of work. Phil has just completed 10 years of work on a dissertation called Global China, Global Crisis, which involved, give you an idea of his capacities, interviews with workers around the world in English, Chinese, and Swahili. I think, following the title of his work, that it would be interesting today to approach global issues of politics and economics through China, especially as that country has been the focus of press and analytical attention, amounting to a kind of continuous media frothing at the mouth. What with the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, the continuing view of China as a looming superpower rival of the United States, and the image of China as a highly organized authoritarian state utilizing the latest tech to control its population. Maybe one place to start, and I'll leave it to Phil to agree or not agree, one place to start is with the idea of China as the looming economic behemoth, the number 2 economic superpower in the world, the coming economic rival and perhaps surpasser of the American economy. How much truth is there in this picture? How significant is China as an economic power, and how is its relationship to the rest of the world? Phil?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, first of all. I think that the dissertation that you're also talking about, there's like a public version, and hopefully we can link that somewhere if people want to read it. It's much, I do warn everybody who has read my other book, this one is much more boring. Lots of charts, lots of math, lots of charts, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, so to answer your question, this is, in some ways it's self-evident that it's true, right? That there is an economic ascent that has occurred in China, that ascent is beginning to challenge certain aspects of US hegemonic power. We see that, the evidence of that in kind of trade war discourse. At the same time, you get the very strong sense that it's absolutely overblown in a lot of different respects. Now, that's something that's true of China in every case. You're reading about China in the media, almost every case, something is overblown. There's this kind of hyperbolic attitude toward China, which in part dates back to old, very, very old, like yellow peril discourse. But then in part, it also has to do just with the fact that there is a difficult cultural linguistic gap to kind of span in figuring out what's going on, right? And then it's added to that is the fact of things like the Great Firewall, et cetera, et cetera. So how can we actually scale what this ascent has looked like? First, we have to understand that this is not the first time that there has been something like a hegemonic ascent in the history of capitalism, right? The US is a clear case, and that's the normal comparison, compared like the US to the UK, and what did that look like? But that's not the only case that we should be looking at. We also have the case of other so-called late developers, but now we would think of them as some of the earlier developers when I'm talking about places like Germany and Japan, right? And it's very interesting. I'm not even talking about post-war Germany and Japan. But if you look at pre-war, like late 19th century Germany and Japan, that's when a lot of the same kind of discursive tools began to be used. And I mean the same in a very literal sense often, people calling them state capitalist regimes, right? Because they had nationalized certain key industries. People pointing to the union in Japan between the large industrial conglomerates and finance and government, right? And in Japan, the use of corvée labor regimes in places like Manchuria and the conquest of Manchuria. And people pointing to those as examples of maybe these aren't even capitalist countries anymore. So this was all very old discourse. There's a lot of interesting history there about like who people are talking about when they're talking about like socialist and state capitalist forces and who they're critiquing. And it has this weird overlap with those regions back in the day. But if we fast forward a little bit, we can see a couple things. First of all, those ascents were not as linear as you might have expected at the time, right? So the ascent of Germany and Japan was like a staggering thing. It happened, and then there was wars that resulted out of it, resulted out of the imperial conflicts that it produced, and then there was a descent in the context of war. There were various periods of post-war reconstruction that went differently in different places. Now, if we look at that, it tells us an important thing about the idea that it's a conflict, right? That it's a competition, it's a conflict. It's not just a natural given that one country is going to overtake another one. It's a conflictual process, and it's a conflict that's fought out between the capitalist classes, largely of those countries, insofar as there is no global proletarian force at the moment that can challenge it.
Using the non-capitalist classes as cannon fodder, though.
Oh yeah, of course.
That's itself don't actually do much of the fighting.
No, absolutely. They are not literally fighting. We are their seconds, The important thing to keep in mind, though, is also that we need to really scale the position of China kind of relative to some of these historical examples. And one thing that I think people forget, it's easy mistake to make with China because of the internal geographic unevenness of Chinese development. So you can look at cities like Shanghai and basically say like, that looks like a modern global city, right? That's really not indicative of the general income level across China. And if you look at some just simple measures like per capita GDP, there's a few very important comparisons which I do think help historically scale this. And one is Chinese per capita GDP, if you adjust it for inflation, is about at the point that Japan was in like the 50s. So we're not talking about like height of U.S.-Japanese Cold War, trade war period. We're talking about like a much lower level of development, and that also is true of a lot of like exactly what industrial lines does China actually dominate in versus ones where maybe they're putting a lot of funding into it, but are they dominant yet? Not quite. But the actual kind of product lines are still on that lower register where like Japan was in the 50s, the 60s, right? There's not a whole lot of competition at the levels that we would expect for a trade war to be really aggressive, because obviously it would be more intense than it is right now, because U.S. suppliers would be like really challenged, right? So those are some important kind of scaling factors. The other scaling factors about, so part of the dissertation that I wrote is about Chinese outward investment, and that's why I was interviewing people in Tanzania, was to go and actually look at on the ground what Chinese factories were in operation, what they were doing, how big the kind of scale of the capital being poured into those projects was. So that is, first of all, always a kind of deflation of the media reporting. Whenever you go look at that stuff on the ground, it deflates like the picture that you've received from the media of like China taking over Africa.
Are you talking about the One Belt, One Road projects?
Yeah, and actually I argue in the dissertation, I argue that the One Belt, One Road, or BRI, whichever you want to frame it, it really doesn't exist as of yet. And if you look at the actual strategic documents that are released by the Chinese government about what it is, it's mostly a strategic orientation, and it's mostly framed as a coming thing, a future kind of strategic orientation. The BRI doesn't, the membership countries, the member countries of the BRI, the ones who have signed memorandums, the ones who signed earlier did not receive on average more investment than countries that didn't sign. So it was no determining factor. It's not a predictor of where Chinese investment went. Now it's a little harder to say because like in a place like sub-Saharan Africa, or actually the African continent as a whole, the majority of countries have signed. So it's kind of like, it's a useless predictor because so many developing countries are part of the class now. But the point is basically that a lot of that is overblown from both sides. From the US side, it's overblown as like a China threat, yellow peril thing. From the Chinese side, it's overblown as like a, win-win development, portray the power of the Chinese state in this kind of helpful developmentalist fashion, et cetera, et cetera. But it's overblown in both respects, and they both have an incentive to exaggerate like the scale, scope of investment. So part of what I was doing was looking at it on the ground.
It's funny, I just interject for a minute. The comparison to Japan and Germany is extremely interesting because I hadn't really thought about it, but now that you mention it, at the time in the 30s, there was an enormous jibber jabber about Hitler is trying to dominate the world. The Germans were so poor, it was such a backward economy compared to England and the United States, that when they invaded Russia, they had very few trucks. They were mostly going with horse-drawn carts and ox-drawn carts. I mean, on foot. So this story of the hysterical fear of the up-and-coming power is, as you say, it's one with a history. Even if, in the case of China, as in Japan, it has a particular Orientalist twist to it. But that's a very interesting point, I think.
Yeah, I think it's something where we want to look back at that history, and we have to also be kind of cautious about. Like the reality is that the Chinese regime today, even though it's bad in the way that many capitalist regimes are, it hasn't reached that level of brutality that like the Japanese imperial system was, or the Germans were at. So I think that's an important thing to like, an important caveat on top of it. Which isn't to say that things aren't getting worse. They definitely are. But yeah, so when we look at this scale, this is the other important scale about like Chinese outward kind of investment and influence, right? That's overblown from kind of both ends, a positive spin on the Chinese side, a negative spin on the US side. But the data is kind of exaggerated in many respects. And when we actually scale it, basically Chinese outward investment, it is increasing rapidly. It's following a pattern that Japan followed especially if you compare it to Japan's kind of second ascent in the post-war period, so into like the 70s and 80s, that increase in Japanese outward investment. And you see in the Japanese case, again, that it's not necessarily a linear thing. Like that investment peaked and then fell. Let me actually bring up a graphic that I had shared. I prepared to share,
so I'm glad
showing.
You brought that one. Yep.
Yeah. This is one of the many charts. Now, there's two interesting things I would point to on this graphic. Now, let me just explain what it is overall. As the title says, it's the global share of outward FDI stock. So it's FDI stock, which is kind of like how much in total is sitting overseas that's owned by some sort of investing country.
For listeners who don't know, FDI is foreign direct investment.
Yes. So foreign direct investment stock. And so this is basically factories, any kind of means of production for the most part that are owned by Chinese capitalists but are hosted in another country outside of China. For this portion, there's some details about what exactly is included in that, what isn't. You can see that Hong Kong is separated from China, even though they are the same administration. Technically, it has to do with how the statistics work. But it's important to scale the two together. So some people would add Hong Kong and China together. The problem with that is that a lot of it is recycled through China, through Hong Kong. Chinese investment goes to Hong Kong. It gets listed twice. So it comes out of Hong Kong and then it's listed again. But it's essentially the same investment. Regardless, the two things I want to point out is, first of all, this is a share. So it's just the percent of the world total of FDI stock. China has, in the last half decade or so, it has ascended above most other competitors except for the United States. Now, if you take the EU as a whole, the EU is still higher. This little gray line above China is the Netherlands, and it's mostly because of acting as a financial hub.
Right.
Now, the other thing that's important to look at in this chart, though, is let's look all the way over on this other side, on the left side of the chart toward 1990, at the peak of Japanese investment. That's this little green line here that's at the height in the left. Japanese investment peaked at around 10% of global FDI stock. China's basically just halfway there at this point. And you can see very slightly here around 2018, it begins to kind of actually level off and decline. I have some other charts that show that decline a little bit better, but this is an important chart because it really shows, A, that China hasn't even reached the point that Japan was at in 1990. It's not even there yet, right? And then second, just look at the absolute dominance of the United States in this chart throughout. Yes. It has declined, right, after like 2000, but a big part of its decline after 2000 was actually just the ascent of activities in the EU, and that you see that ascent in the United Kingdom, and that follows like the role of the City of London, and like Tony Northfield's book documents like what is happening there, and then also other kind of Hong Kong, it does kind of ascend earlier. Asian powers kind of ascend, but really we're talking about absolute dominance for the most part throughout the entire period by the United States and Europe, and that continues today. So in that sense, it's also very kind of overblown. It needs to be scaled according to the actual data.
Phil, can I ask you about the inverse side of this? How much of Chinese economic development today is foreign direct investment into China from the United States and Europe and Japan?
So that's, again, also kind of hard to estimate. It's very different regionally. But the big thing about that is that that sort of dependence and reliance, even though it's still important, has been declining. So throughout the 2010s, it has been declining pretty much just in a linear downward fashion. There has been some talk, the most recent, all this stuff that's going around the kind of party congress and all the big meetings, there has been talk in the Chinese media about people proposing a pivot back toward export production in order to boost GDP briefly and to do a couple other things. There's all these other kind of types of productivity that are kind of reliant on that export relationship, like total factor productivity is basically just has a linear relationship with this export industry in China and many places. And so there's like this talk about we need to boost total factor productivity. To do that, we need to, you know, increase exports again to the wealthy countries. There's two important things that have changed though in this relationship. So one has been that what I said already, the decreasing dependence. That dependence exists in the terms of inter-firm relationships and export relationships, in terms of consumer goods markets. That relationship has been changing. There hasn't been a successful full pivot back to like, you know, selling to the domestic economy, which they've been talking about for like decades. But they're still obviously, you go down to a Walmart here or Fred Meyer or whatever, everything is still going to be made in China for the most part. So nothing about that has really changed substantially, but other forms of that large-scale dependence have decreased in importance with the Chinese, the overall composition of the Chinese economy. So there's a couple of things which have changed at the financial level that are important there, which is a decreasing dependence on like US bond purchases. So bonds have become less important. The Chinese, for the early 2000s, were depressing the value of the renminbi by purchasing US bonds in order to enhance their global trade position relative to other manufacturers. So that has basically stopped. That purchase has stopped, and the total share has been declining pretty substantially. Now, it's been kind of a jagged pattern, but the trend has been downward there. There's talk about reviving it a little bit, but that means also that labor costs have been going up, and the like unit labor costs, kind of in labor as it is valued, kind of in the global market kind of sense. The other important thing, though, that has changed in these trade and investment patterns has been a regional reorientation of the Chinese economy in its global position around Asia, basically, as an important supplier and buyer of goods in the Asian region as a whole. So that relates upward to higher income countries like South Korea, Japan. It also relates downward, though, to really, really important market supplier positions relative to Southeast Asia and Central Asia. And that's been one of the biggest changes, is this slow regionalization. And if you look at the theories that are coming out about the structure of the global economy, a lot of people, and I'm not talking about like far left Marxist theorists here, I'm talking about like hedge fund managers and advisors, are actually kind of starting to get scared and talk about the coming like regionalization of the global economy and deglobalization, what deglobalization will look like. And it's a little bit exaggerated when they talk about it, you know, because we haven't split into currency blocks or anything, but you do see what could be the prologue of that in these changing trade relationships.
Suddenly it bothers them when you have a regionalization of Asia based on China, although the regionalization of Europe or North America was just, you know, free trade. So,
yeah, exactly.
I mean, the regionalization of the world economy has been going on for a very long time. So in a way, China is now borrowing the strategy of the more capitalistically developed Western countries to create its own region. Maybe it's only now in a position to do that.
Yeah, well, and there's other things that have been important changes of kind of just this pace of proletarianization in Africa, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa. It's increased substantially. Where I did my field work in Dar es Salaam, it's been the fastest growing city in the world off and on for like the past decade. It grew from like about, it grew like 600% or something from the beginning of the 2000s to the 2010s, and it's set to be one of the biggest cities in the world, basically by 2030, 2040, and it's growing very, very rapidly. A lot of people are coming, as is the normal story, right? They're coming from the countryside. They're being pushed into a situation where they have to rely on wage labor to survive, but there's not enough wage labor. We kind of know this story if we've read all the communist theory, right? Yes. And the interesting thing that's different today, though, is just the absolute technical level that production exists at. It means that even when there is investment, like the returns and the number of jobs is like insanely small. So there's all this, again, conventional economic research coming from like World Bank researchers, this guy Danny Roderick, who's over at I think Harvard, some Ivy League Northeastern place. And he writes about what he calls premature deindustrialization. And that's basically, and that's basically what is being discussed here. And the cause, there's a recent paper that Roderick and some other researchers have put out. And one of the causes that they point to is this bifurcation in the technical character and formal versus informal character of production, where the bulk of output in new manufacturing enterprises in places like Ethiopia and Tanzania, which are their two case studies, is led by formal large manufacturers at a high technical level. But those places don't generate similar returns in increased employment. All the increases in employment in those countries has come from informal industry, and that's largely like very, very small scale, like handicrafts, essentially. Like you would. We wouldn't even call it a factory in Swahili. In Swahili, factories would be viwanda, and these, if you saw one of these places, it would be a karakana, which is like a workshop. And you wouldn't call it, there's all this like linguistic things locally about how you even refer to it, and people don't. That's really interesting. It's artisanal. It's also called artisanal mining in the mining sector. So that's the kind of general global conditions. And in those conditions, you have a proletarianizing population in these large, very, very quickly growing cities in places like sub-Saharan Africa. And there is increased consumer demand for goods, for manufactured goods, right? And where are those manufactured goods going to come from? Well, some of them are being produced by informal industry there, but Chinese suppliers are becoming increasingly important as the source of those goods, like those consumer goods for the market in places like Tanzania. So if you look at any clothes in Tanzania that aren't part of the mitumba market, which is we send bundles of donated clothes from the West, and then they get resold. They're donated. People think they're just going to people for free, but they're being resold by people. It devastated the local textile industries across the continent. So a lot of countries are trying to ban them. But the countries the markets, the clothing markets that aren't mitumba markets and that aren't like handmade clothes, those are all the lowest quality level of Chinese clothing products that now might not even be made in China, but they're sold by Chinese wholesalers in like Guangzhou, even if they're made in Vietnam. And so there's like an African district in Guangzhou where I've been, in Yueshio district, I think, and they have basically all these like wholesale markets and all these African resellers who live there and then go back and forth. And then when I was in Tanzania in Kariakoo in Dar es Salaam, the market district, I would talk to a bunch of these guys who would just go over to Guangzhou and buy stuff and bring it back. And it's all like the lowest level of like knockoff Gucci. It's like the Gucci that washes off as soon as you wash it once.
This is really fascinating, and maybe we can come back to that. I want to ask you a question which reaches back to some of the topics that you raised a little earlier about the role of the state in development. All capitalism involves interaction of private economic enterprise and the state. How has the Chinese version of this universal pattern evolved since 1949? And particularly, of course, at the present, what is its current state of the relation between government, officialdom, the party, bureaucracy, and private capitalist enterprise?
Well, I think obviously it's a very big question. I would defer, so all the stuff about what exactly was the character of the socialist era in China, I would defer that to like other kind of readings, and it's a complicated question. It gets into all these theoretical things. I would say that the best source for reading about it would be the economic history series from the Chuang Journal, which is chuangcn.org. If people want to read it, you can go
highly recommended.
Yeah, and so that's a good source for those sort of questions. Now, if we talk about more recent history, what's been going on? Okay, there's been liberalization. There was an intensive period of liberalization that was intensive enough that a bunch of very renowned scholars made really stupid predictions about China because they didn't know anything about it, and even wrote books called Neoliberalism with a chapter on China that was systematically wrong about everything that happened, and was just trying to very broadly apply these broad strokes patterns on trends that were very momentary and specific to Europe and North America, basically, and a little bit Latin America. Just try to systematically apply them to Asia in a way that did not work at all. But there was a period of liberalization that kind of stoked the hint that like, oh, is the same thing happening, right? But at the same time, we have to remember that the party state has been there in the background the entire time. They have an apparatus that's pretty systematic for organizing their own personnel, for helping to coordinate investment, right? So as like a traditional kind of state apparatus at that level of like coordinating big infrastructure projects, funneling funds in different places, that was all there. It didn't collapse. It didn't get privatized, right? It got privatized in a different way, in the sense that the party members, the high level of the party, all became capitalists. And that's not a colloquialism. That's not like oh, you bastard capitalists. Right. They are literal owners of capital. Now, this is an important point, and this is something that people like Michael Roberts get wrong just across the board. And part of it is because of this unfamiliarity with the Chinese case and unfamiliarity with like the way that this is spoken of in the Chinese language. You'll see people call them bureaucrats, right? Or, and this is always a good sign that someone doesn't have any clue that what they're talking about with regard to China, is when they call them apparatchiks, using the old Cold War
Russian term.
And it's an important distinction, though, because bureaucrat in English, it covers high-level government technocrats who are not necessarily capitalists, right, but who have maybe a lot of money income from just doing government shit. They're politicians or something, or they're technocrats and, high levels of professional, managerial, whatever. Or it can also cover low-level civil servants. So it covers this huge range of people who are bureaucrats in English. In Chinese, there's not much of an ambiguity about it. If you're talking about a civil servant, you say 公务员, which is just refers to basically like low-level functionary civil servants. Mm-hmm. You can refer to local officials in a bunch of different ways. But if you use terms like guanliao, which is like basically a colloquial term for bureaucrat, and it's what you would usually translate as bureaucrat. There's a couple other variants of it, but it refers almost exclusively to officials above a certain level. And all the officials above that level are literally capitalists. Like they literally own capital, right? So that's a very important part of the Chinese state structure. There's a direct governance on the part of the capitalist class that doesn't exist in most other places where there's at least a smoke screen of like career politicians who are maybe also millionaires and maybe also kind of capitalists, but not necessarily so. And so an important distinction within the Chinese state structure that comes up again and again, just colloquially in the Chinese literature, is the difference between what's called tijine and tijuwai, which is inside the system and outside the system capitalists. So inside the system capitalists are party members who have connections to people in the state and get all kinds of not just rent kickbacks, but they just get like lucrative deals and investment opportunities, right? It's not stuff that's just being siphoned off in classic kind of interest-taking corruption. It's literally just like competing over investment contracts and whatnot. So the people who are outside the system, those capitalists are largely smaller scale or more like 1 foot in China, 1 foot somewhere else. And they, of course, feel some resentment about not getting those things. So that periodically produces these little small-scale conflicts. So the Wukan village conflict, for example, a lot of people don't realize, but behind that, it wasn't just peasants demanding justice or whatever. Those were a lot of the foot soldiers used in the combat were the local villagers. But some of the forces behind that were involved in this inside the system, outside the system conflict between small scale and large scale capitalists. So there are these intra-class conflicts that do play out in China. But one of the big, really important points that is somewhat distinct from other countries is the level of integration through the Communist Party that the capitalist class does have in China. Now, it's a little bit over-exaggerated. There's definitely conflicts that exist in the background that are very hard to see, very opaque, even for very knowledgeable Chinese commentators. They aren't entirely evident, and they come out when you get certain high-level conflicts like the anti-corruption stuff, what happened in the competition in 2012 for who would take the head of the party, and then what happened in who was cracked down on in the subsequent years, right? Targeting some very, very high-level officials and high-level capitalists in China in that process. But you also see it now in these conflicts about the tech companies and the Ant IPO, right? Jack Ma is a party member. He's not outside the system. He's not an outsider. Right. No, yeah, he's inside the system. So this is inside the system type conflict. And the argument basically is that these tech companies are setting the Chinese economy up for some sort of catastrophic, crisis, and that there's an attempt to rein them in. That attempt isn't the benevolent state doing that. It's the organized capitalist class trying to say, look, it's going to be bad for all of us in the long run, even though it's good for this fraction of people. Now, of course, the capitalist class is a global class. So there's another level of intra-class conflict, which is what comes out as like trade wars, which are better understood as like capital wars. This conflict between these factional interests between the Chinese capitalist class and the global capitalist class. And so at that sense, what you can see to the extent that there's a hegemonic ascent and hegemonic struggle, which I would argue is at most the preface to one right now, a prologue to something to come. To the extent that one exists, it's going to be about who can most successfully act as the vanguard of the bourgeoisie. Which country can most effectively demonstrate the capacity to force capitalism to survive, even when it's constantly kind of in this undead state, right? And so people want to claim that the Chinese capitalist class can do that. And the Chinese capitalist class wants to claim that it can do that. But, it remains to be seen if it can be done at all. In the past, if the past is any indication, it takes quite a bit more to engage in that continual process of resurrection that capitalism requires. And then in the face of, imminent human extinction, it's not really clear.
This is the big problem. Yeah. They could presumably keep it going for quite a while at enormous human costs, but it's just going to burn up and flood in the next 20 years. So that's really going to affect everything.
Yeah, and if we dig down a little bit deeper into this question, talk about what is the state really doing when it comes to economic stuff. So one of the other interesting trends that's been increasing over the 2010s in China after the financial crisis, basically, or the Great Recession, however we want to talk about it. After that happens, it looks like Paul might have dropped off. He had an issue with his power supply on his laptop. As you can all see, he was outside. I'll just continue on this point, and we'll see if he pops back in. But we don't have that much longer on the interview anyway. So, in the 2010s, after the Great Recession, so there's a big pouring of money into the economy through basically as a crisis prevention measure, a huge stimulus package. That stimulus package, though, does two things. First, it pours a lot of money into infrastructural projects. Oh, here's Paul coming back in. It pours a lot of money into infrastructural projects, and at the same time, it actually increased a lot of local government debt, because it wasn't the sort of stimulus where the federal government just gives you money. It's the sort of stimulus where the federal government was saying to local governments, propose projects and we'll finance them through the large kind of state banks, and the financing will be like interest-bearing loans. It's not going to be free money. The other thing that happens is that as that kind of continues, this big debt bubble starts to build up, and it's deflated in several ways. It turns into a real estate bubble. It turns into a stock market bubble. But you see in the Chinese econometric data, you see that there's this slow peak and then decrease in the profits of industrial enterprises, in the various ways of measuring the rate of return or rate of profit begins to decline over the decade. And then the investment. Investment's kind of a harder variable in China, but the investment begins to, like gross fixed capital formation in all these different ways of measuring, or fixed capital investment, it peaks and then it begins to decline. And so those are all important factors, because they trace this increasing kind of intervention, trying to retain profitability, trying to prevent crisis, et cetera, et cetera. And this is all a very kind of classic case of stricken with all these different kind of crisis dynamics, faced with a global economic crisis in 2008, faced with building debt that came out of that crisis afterwards, right? You see these increasing kind of interventions on the part of the state, which begin to depress rates of economic growth measured in terms of output. They begin to depress rates of employment growth, and then they begin to, productivity also declines. There's also an important inversion that happens between output growth and productivity growth, but it's not important to get into that here. The point is just that everything starts to slow down, right? And at the same time, that state investment becomes more and more necessary. You can't pull it out, because if you pull it out, the ground of the economy kind of goes away and everything falls through it. So what then begins to happen is you get decreasing returns on what's historically been called the Keynesian multiplier, which is if you have a big infrastructural investment, if you put $1 in, how many dollars back do you get in output for that investment? And so that multiplier begins to decline over time. And that's what you see with the decline of the profit rate of return, whatever, in industry in China. And you see it as manifested as what's called the new normal in both the West and in the Chinese context. The new normal of slower growth rates in China, slower or lower profitability, and just it becomes more and more difficult to turn a profit, especially in the lowest lines of production as unit labor costs and things like that rise. And then the employment growth becomes an even bigger problem with all kinds of demographic pressures that you have in the Chinese economic context. Paul, I see you rejoined us. Are you able to hear what we're saying or talk anymore?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good. My computer overheated, so I had to switch to another device. That's the problem.
Okay. Yeah, it looks sunny there.
Yeah, it is. It's very sunny, and I'm sitting outside the library, and since I'm in the country without Wi-Fi. So, but unfortunately, I'm sitting in the sun, and the laptops don't like that. Could I think it's a kind of natural segue from what you were just talking about, which it always amazes me that it has to be pointed out over and over that there actually is a global economy, and that China is part of it. There isn't the American economy and the Chinese economy, but that the same processes of declining profitability and economic stagnation are operating everywhere, including in a newer dynamic system, although under somewhat different conditions than in the older, less dynamic system. And I wanted to, maybe we have about 15 minutes left. I wanted to move to the other part of the social equation, apart from the other part, the parts of the capitalist class. China is depicted in the media typically as an all-powerful state, controlling everybody through facial recognition software and so forth. But there's also a lot of talk about popular struggles, from feminist activism to a variety of workers' conflicts with employers and the state. How is this feature of Chinese society developing in the present day context of economic slowdown and at the same time the continued growth of China as a world economic power?
Yeah, this is also one of those questions that's kind of complicated and kind of very simple. The interesting thing about it is that when we're talking about the global economy as a global economy, and we look at these like structural shifts in individual national components of that global economy, there's a couple of things which change kind of over time in the long run. One thing that changes, and this is one of those things that's like, if you read all the debates about what Marx means about crisis and whatnot and all these predictions, it's all very confusing, and it seems like people make all the kinds of arguments. But one thing that he predicts very consistently throughout almost all of his work is that the social scale of production should increase over time, right? And that the technical character of production is going to change in the direction of increasing mechanization. Those two things are very consistent, right? And then that also relates to the generation of a larger surplus population, but because the scale of production increases, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's always growing unemployment. But those are all important points because it relates to the state stuff that we were just talking about, because as the social scale of production increases, the state or state-like stuff becomes more important, right? Planning in all these other respects, even within a firm like Amazon or Walmart, right? They have immense state-like apparatuses for planning production, right? And then it's the stupidest position you can take to say that that's the basis for socialism, which is a position that many people take. But the other thing that happens in that long run arc is that the pace of those structural shifts also increases. So the Chinese developmental burst and the cycles of it have gone like really remarkably fast in the scale at which they pivoted from one production line to another, in the scale, the pace of urbanization. And that looks to be going so even faster in Africa now, so fast that it's essentially outpaced employment entirely. So you have proletarianization without industrialization. So that scale increase is the important part here, because it also means that a lot of the patterns that we would expect to see from proletarian struggle based on the past, they don't happen in the same way and with the same breathing room that they used to. So China is already in the stage where it's deindustrializing in employment terms. It reindustrialized briefly after the gutting of the old socialist era industrial belt, which became the Northeastern Rust Belt. It reindustrialized in the 2000s, peaked in the early 2010s, and then it began to decline as manufacturing or industry as a share of total employment. So deindustrialization in those employment terms, right? What that means is that whole peak, which took, decades in other countries and led to the classic like workers movement and whatnot. In the early cases, like literally like half a century, right, of slowly increasing industrial employment, that happened in the space of like a decade, and now it's over. right? So it means that you didn't even get to that full kind of full-blooded labor movement type thing, however you might see it, which mostly is a historical kind of myth how it's portrayed. But regardless of that, there was this peak that came with rising industrial employment in labor struggles in China. Again, that peaked and like through the 2000s and really into the turnover between the 2000s and the early 2010s. Huge increases in strikes, huge increases in riots among migrant workers, huge increases in the number of people trying to organize among those factions. And the peak really was probably in about like 2014 when one of the biggest strikes in Chinese history happened at the Yueyuan shoe factory in Dongguan. And that after that, those strikes started to actually decrease pretty rapidly. Other things began to happen, though, in kind of Chinese social conflicts. You started to see the rise of these weird, like, what would be characterized more as like middle class type conflicts over housing and real estate scams and things like that. So there were a lot more protests among homeowners. At the same time, you began to see increasing agitation on the part of white-collar workers. And so that's something that we've seen today in terms of white-collar workers protesting what's called the 996 employment schedule, which is basically working 9 to 9, 6 days a week. So like these are people who are working as tech workers or graphic designers or whatever your kind of creative high-tech class is in your imagination. Those are the types of jobs people are doing. So there's rebellion against that. There's among those people, there's the talk of Nejuan, which is involution, which is kind of this idea of diminishing returns to kind of the overall productive complex. It comes from the situation of like rural China back in the day, where you would pour labor. There's only a certain limit of returns once you pour enough labor into like a paddy field, how much you're going to get out of it. It's that sort of an idea. The other thing that is happening is increasing revolts among service sector workers now as that becomes more of the economic employment base. So you saw massive revolts among delivery drivers in the last pandemic year. And then the pandemic changed some things, but there was agitation among workers, but it really only reached a peak among these service sector workers and these like delivery drivers, the equivalent of like Uber Eats type drivers. And it's a brutal industry in China as elsewhere. In China, it's even more deadly because of people aren't driving cars for the most part for those jobs. They're driving little scooters. And so people get killed all the time because they're rushing to fill orders and things like that. And then one of the big organizers of service workers was imprisoned, and he ran this network to connect different service workers and help organize among them. And he was imprisoned last year. He went by the name Meng Ju. And so you have those things going on. At the same time, in that period right at the peak, right at or after the peak of organizing, you began to see a massive crackdown on more organized forces of what you might think of as like the Chinese like left or social movement scene. It began through these sequential kind of waves of crackdowns on worker organizing and Chinese feminists. And then it started to kind of spread into other areas and come back again to get more worker organizing. These things called worker centers that are kind of like service centers, education centers for workers in places like the Pearl River Delta. And then it started to also extend to these student groups, which ironically called themselves Maoists.
The Maoists,
and they,
yes.
And they studied, they would go and they would study like Marx and Lenin and Mao in these circles at these high-end universities. A lot of these students were not actually elites, even though they had gotten into these elite universities. They were from poorer backgrounds and had been become the equivalent of like a first-generation college student. And then they had tried to do something very, very classic to our, history, recent, not even recent anymore, but the history of like the new left in the US, which was, we're students, but we want to go into the factories, right? So they had engaged in this process. Ironically, it was called industrialization, just like it was in the West. And then that failed, for a lot of the same reasons that it failed in places like France and the US back in the day. And it was also something that was failing right at the time when all of this discourse about rejecting 996 and Nejuan and all of that began to come to a head. And when you started to see a lot of these higher income, like white collar workers start to have more of this what you can think of as almost like a cultural rejection of capitalist like work ethic, right? And they start to talk about there's this discourse right now about like tangping, which is like lying down, and it's just like I just want to lie down. I don't want to go to work. I just want to like chill. Is basically the sum of it, but it's very very similar
to what's going on here.
Well, yes, but also to what went on here back in the day, back in like 60s, 70s. This is my family history comes from people who had gone back to the land. There's a big movement in China now of young people who are like, oh, I want to move back to the countryside and live like a simple life. And there's big figures on Chinese, like the Chinese equivalent of YouTube, like Li Ziqi, who is like this woman who just films these videos of her rural life and her making like food, and it would be the equivalent of me going out to North Dakota and like churning butter and putting it on YouTube or something. So that sort of thing is also being mirrored. So the weird thing, the weird feeling you get is almost like it's this compressed version of like social struggle history from elsewhere that's been compressed into just a couple decades in China, and it's all kind of happening again. And it's kind of miserable to see it happening again and happening so fast, and it's so weak because it's happened so fast. And then we also kind of have a feeling that we know the direction that it's going in. It's very, very, what I would say that's a little bit more hopeful in the communist sense is if we look at the prospects, right? There was that famous slogan from Athens back in the late 2000s, like 2008 in the Athens riots. That was, "We are an image from the future." I would say the same thing basically exists for China now with relation to Hong Kong. What happened in Hong Kong? Hong Kong is like the image of the future for that kind of developmental arc that China is on right now. And I think there's a strong awareness of that. If you look at the discourse on right-wing message boards in China, that's actually like an explicit thing, that these right-wing like forum posters, and that makes it sound really marginal, like Reddit or something in the US, but it's actually these right-wing message boards. There's evidence that high-level party officials actually have like read them and implemented elements of their critique. One of their big concerns is financialization and like basically becoming Hong Kong, becoming something like Hong Kong. So I think that's the fear. And if we try to try to tie together a lot of these social, both the social struggles and the role of the state, what I think it gets tied together as is this particular period of capitalist development, or this particular just moment in the history of capitalism where there's this huge problem that isn't just a simple problem of profitability, but is this larger cascading problem of social reproduction in general, which includes the state and state intervention. It includes things like family structure and the social anomie of like breakdown of like traditional expectations about what a family and life looks like. It also gets expressed in this form of tangping, or like drop out, go back to the land, reject the like workplace lifestyle. One really notable fact, just to kind of finish on, that has to do with social reproduction is also the gendered aspect of it, because it's absolutely kind of, in one sense, horrifying, but it's also something that doesn't get incorporated into the understanding of these Chinese struggles, is this context where housework, unpaid housework among women has actually increased in China in the past like decade. It's been on the rise, and there's been a bunch of discourse about like sending women back to the household to raise children. There's a bunch of concern about the falling birth rate. They're trying to increase the birth rate, right? Those sort of things. So these are also social reproduction problems in that the sense that derives from like feminist readings of Marx, right? And those are incredibly central to understanding the entire sequence of Chinese struggles, because they kind of link together what's been going on for the past 20 years. The majority of those migrant workers in the early migrant labor regimes in places like the Pearl River Delta were migrant women from rural China. And then they were also leaders of a lot of these strike waves. A lot of the worker centers were also led by these women. And then they incorporated lots of social reproduction demands about things like access to education for migrant children, things like, the way that wages were understood were often related to like family prospects, not just individual. Not just individual kind of wage demands, but like, can I start a family on this money?
Mm-hmm.
And when you read some of like the worker poetry from that era, that's a constant turning point. Is like this idea that you can't have a family, right? You can't have like a lineage or anything like that. Like you can't have
reproduce.
a community. Yeah.
It's like they're saying social reproduction is coming to a halt under these social conditions, which is a very remarkable thing for people to express.
Yeah. And I think it's a thing that unites a lot of struggles that seem very dissimilar, because you look at what seem like middle-class feminist struggles in China, or this recent wave of the banning of all these LGBTQ NGOs in China. All of this is kind of also linked together by this attempt, increasing interventions by the state for like general social reproduction of the capitalist system, right? And then this problem of reproducing labor within that system, and the problem of ensuring that labor power gets created and sustained, essentially.
Well, this is the deepest problem, which is the conflict between, as you just put it, the reproduction of the capitalist system and the reproduction of the population who find themselves living in the middle of it.
Yeah.
And in this, it's actually really fascinating to what extent China is traversing now in 50 years, something which in other parts of the world has taken hundreds of years to unfold, but we're all reaching the end point at the same time.
Exactly. And if I could just say one more thing,
please.
This is kind of the closing point to make it maybe a little bit more doomy and hopeful simultaneously. You can't really see it out this window behind me.
Point of view.
Yeah. So out this window behind me, I've got this beautiful light streaming in, and it looks blue in the screen, but it's this special kind of light that we get here in the American West in these kind of months, late summer, early fall, and it's the type of light where it's just kind of golden in the mornings. It's kind of like a golden fog, and it looks very beautiful, right? And it's really nice to have it kind of stream in your windows. And it's not a complete like smoke cover from the wildfires, but what it is it's the indication that there's a fire out there burning somewhere, right? That something's happening and it's kind of approaching, and it's producing this golden premonition of that inferno to come, right? And that golden light is kind of a good metaphor for how you feel when you're looking at some of these trends in places like China. It seems there is this kind of like doomy feeling. You kind of know what it is. It's building up in the background, but you get the impression that there's some fire out there in the distance. It's like approaching the world, right? And for us as communists, yeah, that's scary, obviously, for the world, but it's also the opening in which insurrectionary possibility abides, right? It's the opening where communist organizing becomes possible, because the status quo itself cannot survive in that sort of an inferno.
Thank you, Phil. That is quite the appropriate end point. I want to thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. And I want to thank you for all the work you've done in writing and thinking and researching. And please write for Phil Neel soon again. And meanwhile, let me just say it has been a pleasure having you with us and talking to you today. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
It was great.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you, Paul. I'm Cal McKeever, curatorial assistant here at the Rail. And at the Rail, we have a tradition of concluding our programming with poetry. So
before you read, could I thank you very much also for having organized this and made it possible technically?
Of course, it was my pleasure. It was my pleasure. So I'm going to read Musée des Beaux-Arts by W.H. Auden. About suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. How well they understood its human position, how it takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window or just walking dully along. How, when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there must always be children who did not specially want it to happen, skating on a pond at the edge of the wood. They never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course. Anyhow, in a corner, some untidy spot, where the dogs go on their doggy life and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. The plowman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had to on the white legs disappearing into the green water, and the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing. A boy falling out of the sky, had somewhere to get to and sailed calmly on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming today, and tune in for the rest of the week. Great. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thanks, Gail.